defeating the Republican candidate by over 41 points. Democrat Keyshawn Scott defeated the Republican candidate William Odin by 41 points in a district in this state house district, the 50th state house district. Yep, with 100% of the results reporting, Keyshawn Scott, folks are talking about the 41-point overperformance, but very few folks are putting a face to the name. Take a look, everybody, as Paolo Cremita says.
South Carolina's 50th State House District has been redder than a fire truck for decades. Until now. Meet Keyshawn Scott, the 24-year-old minister who just pulled off a win so big it's left Republicans scrambling for answers. Was it his grassroots grit, or did the GOP fumble so badly they didn't even see it coming? Let's unravel this David versus Goliath political story. Now, before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video. For decades, Republicans considered South Carolina's 50th State House District untouchable. So what went wrong? If there's one place in the South where Republicans could sleep easy, it was here. This district has been a GOP fortress with a legacy built on conservative dominance. Names like Lindsey Graham come to mind, a master of Republican politics who's been unbeatable in the Palmetto State for years. Statewide elections have rarely even been competitive, more like ceremonious coronations for whichever name appeared next to an R on the ballot. To say this district leaned red would be like calling the ocean damp. It wasn't just Republican, it was Republican defined. But apparently, that definition didn't sit as comfortably with voters as the party assumed.
That former Vice President Kamala Harris won by only about 5 in 2024. So about a 36-point overperformance by the Democratic candidate Keyshawn Scott. Of Representative-elect Keyshawn Scott, he's a pro-choice young rural candidate, can defeat fascism. We're getting word from the leader of the DNC, Ken Martin, who's been commenting on a lot of these big Democratic overperformances in the recent special elections across.
Enter Keyshawn Scott, the 24-year-old newcomer who delivered a 41-point shellacking that shattered the GOP's grip. 41 points. That's not a close race. It's an electoral earthquake, and this result didn't just surprise the Republicans, it sent them into full tailspin mode. Scott's win wasn't some nail-biter where one network hesitates to call it. It was decisive. So decisive that some GOP leaders reportedly didn't even believe the initial numbers when they first rolled in. This was a district where Republicans could have sent a scarecrow holding a Bible and a Second Amendment t-shirt and likely still won, with double digits. It's pretty clear Keyshawn Scott didn't simply stumble upon a fluke victory. So how on earth did this happen? A big part of the problem might have been the Republicans' tendency to treat their strongholds like locked safes. They assumed their dominance in places like the 50th was eternal, but this mindset proved fatal. Confidence is one thing, overconfidence is dangerous. They didn't seem to notice the storm brewing, and that storm came in the form of frustrated voters. Red flags were everywhere. Well, technically, I guess they were red and blue flags, but the GOP ignored them. That's the dangerous thing with safe seats. Complacency starts creeping in. When you feel untouchable, you stop asking questions like, what do the voters actually care about? Instead, you stick with the usual talking points, assume the base is locked in, and call it a day. Except in this case, the locked-in voters appeared to have found the key. That key? Their own discontent. Just look at the broader struggles the Republican Party has been facing lately. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act is the perfect example. What sounds more like a high school student council prank. Its sloppy rollout and practically incomprehensible promises managed to alienate even loyal supporters. It turned into a political comedy sketch where no one could decide what the bill was actually for. Healthcare, immigration, or was it just a showpiece for a Fox News segment? Whatever it was not what voters were asking for. Republicans in South Carolina might as well have been holding press conferences to let people know they had no idea how to organize themselves. It's like they were too busy debating debating what font to use on their big, beautiful bill to notice that their electoral house was on fire. Meanwhile, Scott didn't win by dumping millions into TV ads or organizing gigantic rallies with confetti and theme songs. Instead, he dug into what actually matters to people, and did it well. His campaign targeted issues that voters felt daily: healthcare, education, jobs. These aren't revolutionary topics, but they're what people want addressed. Republicans, on the other hand, were out here talking about their gripes with DC liberals and culture wars. Spoiler, a 30-second rant on woke mobs doesn't help when your road has a sinkhole the size of a minivan. Keshin Scott's campaign wasn't flashy, but it didn't need to be. Every voter he managed to talk to, every local meeting he attended, and every issue he focused on helped chip away at what was once considered Republican bedrock. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't magic. Scott listened, and above all, understood. So what was his secret weapon? Let's break it down. In an age where politics is often about who can shout the loudest or get the most retweets, Keshin Scott's campaign was, well, kind of boring. No viral sound bites, no flashy slogans. But here's the thing, it worked. While his opponent leaned into headlines straight out of Fox News, ranting about woke agendas and the cultural boogeyman of the week, Scott went in a completely different direction. He focused on what voters actually asked him about: roads, schools, healthcare, and jobs. Not exactly the stuff of Twitter wars, but apparently it's the stuff hardworking families wanted to hear. Scott's approach might sound basic, but it was revolutionary in its simplicity. His campaign zeroed in on what he referred to as grocery store problems. You know, the kind of issues people complain about while loading up their carts. Why is getting to a doctor so expensive? When is someone going to fix this road? How am I supposed to find a good paying job? These were the bread and butter concerns for voters in places like Lee County, where the struggles of day-to-day life couldn't be solved with debates about drag queens. And Scott got that. His platform included workforce development programs, resources for small businesses, and better healthcare access. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't need to be. Meanwhile, Scott's opponent ran a campaign seemingly designed for a national cable news audience rather than for the people in his own district. His strategy leaned hard into the culture wars. He talked about sinister woke mobs, raged against drag performances, and even threw in a few half-hearted nods to gun rights for good measure. The problem? None of those things were the top concerns for the locals he was supposedly representing. It's one thing to fire up Twitter trolls. It's another to connect with voters who are driving over crater-filled roads just to make it to a shift that doesn't pay enough to cover healthcare bills. And here's where Scott's so-called boring approach really shined. By keeping the focus on tangible, fixable issues, he tapped into something powerful: trust. Voters didn't see a flashy politician made for TV. They saw someone who was listening. One of the clearest contrasts was healthcare. Scott didn't just say he would fight for better access. He made it clear what that would look like: expanded clinics, easier access to specialists, and more resources to prevent medical bankruptcies. For a district where access to healthcare is a constant worry, that wasn't just policy, it was personal. Workforce development was another centerpiece of Scott's platform, and it resonated. Voters didn't need vague promises about job creation. They wanted specifics. Scott proposed job training programs for young people and support for workers wanting to learn new skills. This wasn't the kind of thing that made national headlines, but it mattered to families trying to put food on the table. His focus was laser sharp: invest in communities from the ground up and give people what they need to thrive. Meanwhile, while Scott talked about fixing potholes, his opponent was out here ranting about drag queens. Guess who voters cared about more? Nobody's driving to work in the morning, swerving to avoid hitting a pothole while thinking, man, if only my representative would ban a drag brunch. Instead of recognizing this disconnect, Scott's opponent doubled down on the Fox News headlines, as if screaming about wokeness was going to fill the financial gaps in voters' realities. Spoiler alert, it didn't. What's perhaps most significant is how Scott's campaign reflects broader trends in voter priorities. Research shows that in struggling, working-class communities, most people place economic stability and practical solutions above culture debates. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. And despite the GOP's usual financial and organizational edge in South Carolina, Scott didn't win by running a big budget campaign or rolling out celebrity endorsements. He didn't have flashy commercials. He didn't need a snappy catchphrase. He won because he stayed grounded, focused, and relevant. While Republicans talked over voters with prepackaged, divisive catchphrases straight from conservative pundits, Scott talked to voters about what actually mattered in their lives. It's an old school approach, but as Scott showed, it's far from outdated. It's hard not to think about what this victory could mean for the bigger picture. Scott's strategy isn't just a one-off success. It's the kind of playbook that could shake up elections in places where Democrats have written themselves off for years. His win proved that deep red districts aren't necessarily as invincible as they seem, so why not give people something to vote for instead of ignoring them entirely? But what about Scott's opponent? How did his campaign strategy backfire so badly? Let's talk about that. Here's the thing about culture wars. They don't pay hospital bills or pave roads. But for some reason, the Republican candidate in this race seemed to think voters wanted a list of Fox News buzzwords instead of solutions to their actual problems. His campaign was basically a greatest hits compilation of everything vaguely alarming to conservative media audiences. You could almost picture him scrolling through a teleprompter that just read, woke agendas, drag shows, and protecting freedom. And maybe, in theory, those talking points are supposed to fire up the base. Out here in the real world, though, they landed flat. Voters in South Carolina's 50th district didn't need someone yelling the word woke on repeat like a broken record. They needed someone who noticed the potholes big enough to swallow their cars. Instead, the Republican candidate seemed committed to showing how in touch he was with Fox News viewers, not with the folks in his own district. The message wasn't just irrelevant, it was downright laughable for people whose daily struggles had nothing to do with whatever cultural agenda he was ranting about. One voter even described his campaign as tone deaf, saying it felt like watching someone try to fight a ghost instead of addressing real issues. This approach was like showing up to a potluck with a megaphone instead of food. Loud? Sure. Helpful? Not even a little. A candidate can scream about protecting traditional values all day, but if voters are drowning in medical debt or can't afford the gas to get to work, they're not exactly flocking to the polls to stop drag queens. The Republican campaign ignored what voters were shouting from rooftops. Fix the roads, lower healthcare costs, create real jobs. These aren't abstract or impossible problems. They're daily struggles that don't go away just because someone throws out a few buzzwords about freedom. And the results weren't just embarrassing, they were revealing. What happened here highlights a real problem for Republicans, especially in areas like South Carolina's rural districts. There's been a growing divide between the GOP's messaging and what voters are actually dealing with. Research shows that struggling communities, particularly in economically tight-knit areas, prioritize things like job security, healthcare, and basic infrastructure over culture war battles. Yet instead of addressing those issues, the Republican Party seems more determined than ever to pivot all its energy toward cultural grievances. This disconnect isn't new, but it's becoming more obvious. For decades, Republicans could rely on places like the 50th district staying red no matter what. The assumption was that the base would vote for them as long as they showed up, labeled the other side radical liberals, and threw in a few promises about gun rights and tax cuts. But the problem is that formula doesn't work when people's frustrations are mounting, and you're not offering anything to help them out. You can only handwave economic and healthcare crises for so long before people start to notice you're not doing anything productive. The 50th district is a perfect case study for how this strategy backfires. Keshawn Scott's victory didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because Republican messaging felt like a bad joke to the people hearing it. The GOP candidate's focus on culture wars came across as completely out of touch when stacked up against the local issues voters actually cared about. For example, healthcare was a pressing concern across the district. People weren't asking for outrage about wokeness. They were asking for affordable options to see a doctor without worrying about going bankrupt. But instead of addressing those realities, the Republican campaign seemed intent on turning every stump speech into a mini Tucker Carlson segment. If you're more worried about the fictional threat of drag queens in libraries than about the very real hospital bill piling up on someone's kitchen table, you're not going to win them over. It wasn't a lack of effort. The GOP spent money, sent out campaign materials, and hit all the familiar conservative talking points. The slogan-heavy strategy was there. What wasn't there was any meaningful connection to the community's needs. One resident summed it up perfectly. He just didn't get it. We're not sitting around talking about drag shows at dinner. We're talking about if we have enough to make it through next week. These kinds of frustrations underline the fundamental problem. The Republican candidate was speaking past his voters, not to them. The bigger issue is this wasn't an isolated misstep. Across the country, we've seen the GOP leaning hard harder on culture wars while ignoring bread and butter issues. It's a risky gamble, and in this case, it failed spectacularly. It's not every day you see a Republican lose by 41 points in South Carolina, but Scott's opponent managed to do it by focusing so much on the culture war that his campaign became irrelevant. This wasn't a district full of Democratic activists. This was a historically conservative place, the kind Republicans shouldn't even have to think about winning. But when you're this far removed from what voters want, even the reddest of strongholds can surprise you. At the heart of it all is a basic political mismatch. The Republican Party keeps crafting its platform for audiences on national TV, but elections aren't won on cable news. They're won by paying attention to the people who are actually voting. As voters grow more frustrated with tone-deaf campaigns and out-of-touch policy promises, we may see this dynamic play out in other districts Republicans used to consider safe. If that happens, the GOP will only have itself to blame. They handed Keshin Scott this victory on a silver platter by ignoring what voters cared about. Scott didn't have to fight them on their own terms. He simply gave people something better to vote for. So what does this mean for the future of politics in deeply red states like South Carolina? Keshin Scott's victory is more than just an upset. It's a warning shot for Republicans. The result isn't just about one district flipping blue. It's about voters rejecting all the noise and asking for real solutions. For years, the GOP has leaned on culture wars like a crutch, but the cracks are showing. People don't want stunts. They want jobs, healthcare, and decent schools. If Republicans want to keep their strongholds, they might want to start listening instead of ranting about woke agendas. As for Democrats, this might just be the start of a new playbook for deep red districts.